Thanks, Bruce. Matt gave me this title. I didn't have the heart to tell him that I always get confused about what exactly is a strategy and what's a tactic, so I'll just bumble through it. The research we're going to present comes from a lot of largely GRDC funded resources, the Water Use Efficiency Initiative, which ended last year, new early sowing project, and also the new Stubble initiative and dual purpose cropping, as well as some from Grain and Graze. And I'll acknowledge our farmer collaborators and also co-authors, which are in the article. This year, I myself didn't actually do any trials in an effort to avoid Matt fingering me for GRDC updates. It didn't work, so I've got to bring in Danielle and also Anika, because they actually ran some trials this year. Okay, so to cut straight to the point, what we're largely talking about today is flowering time of wheat and how you achieve that. And certainly the learnings coming out of the Water Use Efficiency Initiative, one of the key drivers of water use efficiency in wheat crops, and one of the key things you can do in crop, you can do lots beforehand in terms of summer fallow management and break crops, but in crop, one of the key things is getting wheat crops to flower at the right time. And so what I'm talking about, an optimal period for wheat, it looks something like this in any given environment. So here we have, this is APSIM output, we have flowering date down here versus yield, and in any particular environment, this curve here is the yield. You'll have this period where yields are optimised, and it's different for each environment. So this is Kerrang in northwest Victoria versus Lake Bolac, so obviously the optimal period's a month apart. But what's driving that optimal period is it's a compromise between a lot of factors, and first and foremost is largely the seasonal water availability. So when we have water and when crops start to run into terminal drought, the temperatures in terms of development, but also frost and heat, the radiation at that time. So the temperature drives development, radiation gives you growth, you've got to trade those things off, and also frost and heat, and those things compromise to give you that optimal period. And it really need to stress that it is a compromise. There's no perfect time to have crops flowering. You'll almost certainly be running into a combination of these problems, but it's making sure you trade them off to maximise water use efficiency and yield. And just an illustration of that, in our trials from the Water Use Efficiency Initiative, all our highest yielding treatments usually had 5 to 10% frost damage. Okay, so I guess the strategy that we've got to go for in order to maximise farm water use efficiency and yield is to have as much crop flowering during that optimal period as possible. And there's three tactics you can use to achieve this. The first one is one that's not employed very often in Victoria, but you can sow winter wheats if you get a sowing opportunity any time from late February through to April, and that will get your crop flowering in the optimal period. You can sow slower maturing spring wheats, starting from about mid-April into May, and this is what we do a lot of, particularly in northwest Victoria. So our mid-fast wheats starting in late April, and we dry sow if we don't have a break, in order to try and get as much crop flowering during the optimal period as possible. So just to sort of have a look at that on a seasonal basis and the way these wheats develop, winter wheat you can sow back here has a very long juvenile phase, which also makes them good for dual purpose, and then gets into stem elongation, then your anthesis during your optimal period. Slow maturing spring wheat you can't really sow before the middle of April, because the photo period, the days are too long, and it trips their photo period development. They have a longer stem elongation phase, so they're not as good for grazing as the winter wheats, but this is often associated with higher yield potential. And then your mid-maturing spring wheat, all flowering at the same time, sown from different dates. Okay, so I guess the learning from the Water Use Efficiency Initiative, particularly in our trials in New South Wales, was that slower maturing spring wheats and winter wheats sown early were yielding a lot more than our mid-fast varieties sown later. And that's because they used a bit more water, they grew deeper roots, but they were also much more water use efficient because they had less evaporation and higher transpiration efficiency. So this is one of our trial results from June E, where we measured all these things. These are the yields. Eagle Hawk is our slow maturing spring wheat, sown in its optimum time on the middle of April, versus Lincoln sowed in its optimum time on the 17th of May. Large yield difference between those two, obviously. Eagle Hawk growing its roots 30 centimetres deeper and extracting more water, so it used about 20 mils more water compared to Lincoln. It had about 10 mils less evaporation because it was covering the ground faster and you're losing less to evaporation. And because it also grew more during the winter, when plants trade water for dry matter more efficiently, it had a higher transpiration efficiency, and that gave it a much higher water use efficiency than our sort of business as usual approach. And the thing about this strategy, I suppose, of taking early sowing opportunities with slow maturing varieties is it's a yield effect that scales up to the whole farm. So if you think about a farm situation where you've got a slow maturing variety like Ballarat and a main season wheat like Gregory, and you've got a 20-day sowing program, if you start on the 5th of May, which is generally when people start to sow Gregory, and finish on the 25th of May, based on our results there from June E, you end up with a 4.7 tonne per hectare farm average. If you introduce the very slow variety that lets you start sowing earlier, you start earlier on the Ballarat and you finish earlier on the Gregory, and you pick up a much higher average yield because you're getting this yield advantage of the Ballarat and all your Gregory's going in on time. So you're not having these late sown paddocks letting the team down. Okay, so that's southern New South Wales, but in Victoria, I guess we've got two different rainfall zones and two challenges in our rainfall zones where early sowing might be able to help. In the high rainfall zone, sowing earlier, and Anika's going to go into this, really creates the yield potential that are on offer in those zones, and also overcomes a lot of the constraints in terms of waterlogging and slower growth and invertebrate pests. In the low rainfall zone, having slower maturing varieties is really more about taking opportunities as they arise. There may not be such a big yield advantage, but given our drying autumns, we need to be able to take the opportunities as they arise, and just in order to get more of the cropping program flowering in the optimal window. So southern New South Wales, this stuff's easy because we've got well-adapted varieties in terms of winter wheats and also slow maturing spring wheats. We also have a few more sowing opportunities because our rainfall distribution's temperate, and there's a bit of a history of early sowing for dual purpose. And adoption's been pretty rapid in southern New South Wales, and this is the sort of a result we saw from 2013. This guy farms at Ardlethan and west of Ardlethan, which I suppose is sort of equivalent environment to something like Warwick-Nabeal or North Warwick-Nabeal. His Ballarat, which he planted between the 4th of April and the 18th of April, averaged 3.5 tonnes, and his main season wheats sown between 1 May and 7th of June averaged 2.1. So really reflecting those trial results. Can't talk about early sowing without mentioning the F word, and I guess if Harm Van Rees isn't here to call me Dr. Frost yet, but he feels uncomfortable about having all crop flowering in the one period of time. But my take on this is that whilst frost is a very, very serious threat, as this fellow clearly illustrates, I typed in frost into Google to try and find a picture because I never get up early enough to take photos of frost, and that's what I came up with, so I thought that was pretty good. I don't think delaying sowing is the best way of managing it. In fact, I'm pretty sure of it. There's other more effective ways. For instance, to avoid the 18th of October frost, which wiped out a lot of southern New South Wales and northeast Victoria, would have had to be sowing in July to avoid that, which pretty much guarantees you a crap yield in the majority of years. There's better ways to do it, and particularly with other crop types, more resistant crop types, hay, pasture. I think there's a lot to be gained out of zoning farms according to elevation, and something that's a bit controversial, but we've got some good data on is burning stubbles in frost-prone areas. And I'll just show you some data to back that up. This is from our trial site at Temora, where we have stubble grazed or not grazed, and we have it burnt or retained. You can see that burning stubble in our nil graze basically halved our frost damage. So we burnt the stubble, we only had 30% frost damage, 60% where it was retained, and we picked up 1.1 tonnes per hectare of wheat yield, and similar story in the canola, just not quite as dramatic. And that's just not us fluking at one particular site. Ben Biddulph in Western Australia recorded something very similar at his trial site with the Nyabing Farm Improvement Group. So standing stubble yield versus removed low in the landscape, and standing versus removed high in the landscape, big differences in yield and frost-induced sterility there. So, in summary, strategy is to get as much crop flowering during the optimal period as possible in your environment. Remember the 3 ways of achieving it: winter wheat, slow spring wheat, and mid-fast spring, including dry sowing. And from our experiments, if you can take those early opportunities, if you've got adapted varieties, which is a bit of a limitation in Victoria, the earlier sown ones will yield as well or better than the mid-fast sown later. And people sort of groan and roll their eyes and say, oh, well, how many varieties do I need to keep? But really, you can cover a 3-month sowing window with only 2 to 3 varieties, but one of them has to be winter. And you need to be responsive to autumn conditions, which people don't necessarily like, the logistics of managing different seed stocks and sown areas, but the yield benefits are probably worth the logistical hassles.